Okay. Sorry to have chased people away, but we are here for Weekly Marx. The Chapter 6, Marx's Economic Manuscript of 1864 to 65, translated by Ben Fowkes and edited by Fred Moseley. We're somewhere in the section on absolute ground rent, and we'll just keep continuing. Because I know everyone wants to hear my dulcet tones. All righty then. I apologize for the slight overlap. We have assumed that land newly brought into cultivation is of inferior quality to the worst of the land previously cultivated. This is page 756. If it is better, it bears a differential rent. Here, however, we are investigating precisely the case where rent does not appear as differential rent. There are only two possible alternatives at this point. Either the land newly taken up is worse than or is just as good as the land previously cultivated. We've already investigated the possibility the position where it is worse. What we now have to investigate is where it is just as good. Equally good land, and even better, can be newly cultivated as agriculture develops just as much as worse land can, as we've already shown in the case of differential rent. Firstly, because in the case of differential rent and rent in general, since even in the case of non-differential rent, the question still always arises of whether the fertility of the land on the one hand and its location on the other permit it to be cultivated at all at the governing market price with profit and rent. Whether the market price is high enough always depends on these two conditions of fertility and location. Two factors operate in opposite directions. Sometimes they counterbalance each other, and sometimes one outweighs the other. A rise in market price, assuming that the means of cultivation remain the same and that mechanical progress or progress of another kind does not form a new element, which did not previously fall into the balance in favor of an extension of cultivation, assuming, in one word, that the price of cultivation has not fallen, may bring into cultivation more fertile land that was previously excluded from competing by its location. Or else, in the case of less fertile land, it may increase the advantage of location so much that this balances the low yield. Alternatively, even if the market price does not rise, the location can allow better land to join the competition by way of improved means of communication, as we've seen on a large scale with the prairie states of North America, that is, railroads. Even in countries which have long been civilized, this is constantly the case, if not on the same scale as in the colonies, whereas Wakefield correctly notes, location is decisive. Thus, firstly, the contradictory effects of location and fertility and the variability of the location factor, which is constantly balanced out, bringing about constant, admittedly progressive changes, which also tend to balance out, alternatively bring equally good, better or worse tracts of land into competition with those previously cultivated. Secondly, the development of natural science and agronomy leads to changes in the understanding of the fertility of different types of soil and the attitude towards it. This fertility itself, in fact, alters in line with changes in the means of valorizing it, which are at the society's disposal. We entirely leave out of account here that different plants are subject to wide variations in fertility. Here we're concerned only with the main sources of food. Fertility would only be constant if the means of valorizing it were immediately and simultaneously available, discovered, or created. In the recent past, for example, light variety of soils, which were previously considered inferior, have risen to the first rank in France and the eastern counties of England. On the other hand, land which was considered poor not on account of its general chemical composition, but because mechanical and physical obstacles stood in the way of its cultivation, was turned into good land as soon as the means for overcoming these obstacles were discovered. Thirdly, in all countries of old established civilization, old historical and traditional conditions in the form of crown lands, common lands, etc., have withheld great stretches of land from agriculture in a purely arbitrary manner. These lands are gradually coming under cultivation. If one contemplates the history of the Enclosure Acts in England and the history of the common lands, which they successively brought under cultivation, a process which is continuing, nothing appears more ridiculous than the fantastic idea that this process was directed by a modern agricultural chemist on the model of Herr von Liebig, and that certain fields were marked off for cultivation on account of their chemical properties, and others were excluded. Fourthly, leaving aside the fact that the level of population and capital reached at any given time sets a certain limit to the extension of agriculture in a country, though this limit can in turn be stretched, the decision as to whether more or less new land is taken into cultivation depends in a given situation not only on accidental factors, which have a temporary influence on market prices, such as a series of favorable or unfavorable seasons, but also on the overall condition of the capital market and the business conjuncture in that country. In some periods, the possibility that uncultivated land may yield the farmer an average profit, whether he pays rent or not, will not suffice to draw additional capital towards agriculture. At other times, when capital is abundant, it streams into agriculture without even a rise in market prices as long as the normal conditions are fulfilled. Better land than that previously cultivated is in fact only excluded from competition by the element of location or by previous barriers to the valorization of its peculiar features, which have not yet been broken through. That is, failure of agronomy to break through the barriers, for instance, or by a lack of mechanical means, or else for accidental reasons. We have only to deal, therefore, with kinds of land which are just as good as those last cultivated. Leaving aside the above-mentioned capital and credit conditions, there always exists a distinction between the new land and that last cultivated in the shape of the varying cost of plowing up, and it depends on the level of market prices and the situation of the market as a whole, whether this is undertaken or not. Once this land actually does come into competition, the market price falls back to its previous level so that the new land will bear the same rent as the old land, since its fertility is the same on our assumption. Now, the hypothesis that it will bear no rent is demonstrated by its supporters by assuming that what should actually be proved, namely that the last land did not bear any rent. Now, one could prove in the same way that the last houses to be built yield no rent besides simple interest on the buildings, even if they're rented out. The fact of the matter is that they yield rent even before they bring in house rent, for they often stand empty for a long while. Just as successive capital investments on one piece of land can yield a proportionate surplus product, and hence the same rent, so can fields of the same quality as those last cultivated yield the same product at the same cost. It would otherwise be incomprehensible how fields of the same quality are ever brought under cultivation successively and not all at once, or indeed why there are any at all, since the first would draw after it the competition of all the others. The landowner is always ready to draw a rent, i.e., to receive something for nothing, but capital requires certain conditions in order to fulfill his wish. The mutual competition of plots of land depends not on the landowner's intention to have them compete, but rather on the availability of capital to compete on new fields with the old. Since agricultural rent proper is simply a monopoly price, this rent can only be small, just as absolute rent can only be small in normal conditions, whatever the excess value of the product over its production price may be. The essence of absolute rent consists in this: equally large capitals produce different amounts of surplus value in different series of production according to their differing average composition, given an equal rate of surplus value or equal exploitation of labor. In industry, these different amounts of surplus value are equalized to give the average profit, or are divided uniformly between the individual capitals as aliquot parts of the total social capital. Whenever industry needs land, whether for agriculture or for the extraction of raw materials, landed property blocks this equalization process for the capitals invested on the land and captures a portion of the surplus value which would otherwise go into the equalization process, giving a general rate of profit. Rent, then, forms a part of the value of commodities, in particular of their surplus value, which simply accrues to the landowners who extract it from the capitalists instead of to the capitalist class, who have extracted it already from the workers. It is assumed in this connection that agricultural capital sets more labor in motion than an equally large portion of non-agricultural capital. The extent of this gap, or whether it exists at all, depends on the relative development of agriculture and industry. By the nature of the case, this difference must decline with the progress of agriculture, unless the ratio in which the variable part of the capital declines vis-a-vis the constant part is still greater in industrial capital than in agricultural. This absolute rent plays a still more important role in extractive industry proper, where one element of constant capital, raw material, completely disappears, and where, with the exception of branches for which the portion consisting of machinery and other fixed capital is very significant, the lowest composition of capital invariably prevails. Precisely here, where rent seems to derive from a monopoly price alone, extraordinary favorable market conditions are required for the commodities to be sold at their value, or for rent to equal the entire excess of surplus value in a commodity over and above its price of production. This is the case, for example, with rent for fishing grounds, quarries, natural forests, etc. Footnote 39. Wherever rent exists, differential rent always appears and always follows the same laws as it does in agriculture. Wherever natural forces can be monopolized and give the industrialist who makes use of them a surplus profit, whether it be a waterfall, a productive mine, fishing grounds, or a well-situated building site, the person indicated as the owner of these natural objects, by virtue of his title to a portion of the earth, seizes this surplus profit from the capital in question in the form of rent. As far as land for building is concerned, Adam Smith has discussed how the basis of its rent, as with all non-agricultural land, is governed by agricultural rent proper, with the possible exception of the rent paid for mines. In view of the evident exploitation of increases in population and production on the part of the lazy parasites who own the land, this non-agricultural rent is characterized first by the preponderant influence that location exerts here on the differential rent. Differential rent is very important, for example, in the case of vineyards, and secondly, by the palpable and complete passivity displayed by the owner, whose activity consists simply in exploiting the progress of social development towards which he does not contribute and in which he risks nothing, unlike the industrial capitalist, and finally by the prevalence of a monopoly price in many cases, and particularly the most shameless exploitation of poverty. For poverty is a more fruitful source for house rent than the mines of Potosi were for their owners. The tremendous power this gives landed property when it's combined together with industrial capital in the same hands enables capital practically to exclude workers engaged in a struggle over wages from the very earth itself as their dwelling place. Here, one section of society demands a tribute from the other for the right to inhabit the earth, Just as in landed property in general, the proprietors demand the right to exploit the Earth's surface, its bowels and air above, and thereby the maintenance and development of life. The rise in population and the consequent increase in the need for housing is not the only factor that must necessarily increase the rent on buildings. So too does the development of fixed capital, which is either incorporated into the earth or strikes root in it, like all industrial buildings, railways, factories, storehouses, docks, etc., which rest on it. It is impossible, even with Carey's determination, to confuse house rent, inasmuch as this is interest on the capital invested in the house, with rent of land pure and simple, particularly when it's in England. The landowner and the speculative builder are completely different people. Two elements come into consideration here. On the one hand, the exploitation of the earth for the purpose of reproduction or extraction. On the other, the space that is required as an element for any production and any human activity. On both counts, landed property demands its tribute. The demand for building land raises the value of land as space and foundation, while at the same time, there is a growing demand for those elements of the Earth's physical constitution that serve as building material. For the same reason, in cities that are experiencing rapid growth, particularly where building is carried on with industrial methods, as in London, it is the ground rent and not the house that forms the real object of speculation. This passage we quote is also interesting because it shows how building has turned into a capitalist trade. Footnote 45. Now, the next section is from the report on the Bank Acts of 1857, examination of Mr. Edward Capps, builder. He says here, 5413, you must build houses now ready for the market, the same as a bootmaker must make boots or a stocking manufacturer must make stockings or any other article. People do not now, generally speaking, order houses to be built so much as they did in those days, the days of his childhood. But if they want houses, they go around and select those which are most suitable for them. Therefore, builders find it just as necessary in the present day to have their commodities ready for the market as any other persons carrying on any other branch of business. It was not so much so formal. 5414. With regard to speculative building, the change has been more of this nature. Formerly, 40 years ago, when what houses were built upon speculation were built out of the savings and profits of builders upon their ordinary jobbing business, namely the business they did to order, and it answered very well at that day. Builders conducted their transactions with very great moderation and prudence. They always had 3 or 4 houses upon the stocks, just to keep their men in constant employment, their main reliance being on their ordinary business. But now, the system of building is quite altered in that respect. A man can do no good by doing business in that way. He must go and take a large plot of ground, and he must perhaps engage to lay out 20 or 50 times the amount of his own capital upon it. And if he can get through his undertaking before any crash comes, he can run up a lot of structures, and many of them are very flimsy, I'm sorry to say, at the present day. He may make a good slice of money, but he is liable to be pulled up very suddenly by a failure in the finances from the uncertainty of our present monetary system. 5415. Then at present, the general practice is to build upon a large scale, relying on a demand for houses when they have been built. Yes. And raising money upon mortgage as the buildings proceed. Almost the whole of Belgravia and Tyburnia and the countless thousands of villas around London are built upon that principle. There's no risk at all involved here for the landowning gentleman. Either they sell the ground as freehold and anticipate the rent by including it in the price, or they have the building itself as security. 5417. Then, in general, the materials are paid for, but the money is borrowed. The money is borrowed. The man must have some capital to begin with. I might take a piece of ground requiring a capital of £50,000. I would commence a speculation of that kind, probably with not more than £1,000 or £1,500, just enough to start with. 5435. I think a man who wishes to rise in the world can hardly expect to rise by following out a fair trade, what is called a jobbing trade. He will not make sufficient profit out of it. It is necessary for him to add speculative building to it, and that must be done not on a small scale, it must be done on a large scale, for the builder makes very little profit out of the buildings themselves. He makes the principal part of the profit out of the improved ground rents billed to suit. Perhaps he takes a piece of ground and agrees to give £300 a year for it. By laying it out with care and putting certain descriptions of buildings upon it, he may succeed in making £400 or £450 a year out of it. And his profit would be the increased ground rent of £100 or £150 a year, rather than the profit of the buildings, which he puts upon the ground, that in many instances he scarcely looks at all. The actual rent of mines is determined exactly as is agricultural rent. This is back to Marx. There are some mines of which the produce is barely sufficient to pay the labor and replace altogether with its ordinary profits the stocks employed in them. They afford profit to the undertaker of the work, but no rent to the landlord. They can be wrought advantageously by nobody but the landlord, who, being himself the undertaker of the work, gets the ordinary profit of the capital which he employs in it. Many coal mines in Scotland are wrought in this manner and can be wrought in no other. The landlord will allow nobody else to work them without paying some rent, and nobody can afford to pay any. Adam Smith, footnote 46. It is necessary to distinguish whether the rent flows from a monopoly price, because a monopoly price for the products or for the land itself exists independently of it, or the products are sold at a monopoly price because of the existence of a rent. By monopoly price here, we mean any price determined simply by the desire and the ability of the buyer to pay, independently of the price of the product as determined by the general price of production and value. A vineyard, for example, bears a monopoly price if it produces wine which is of quite exceptional quality, but can be produced only in relatively small quantities. By virtue of this monopoly price, the wine grower, whose excess over the value of his products is determined purely and simply by the wealth and the preference of fashionable wine drinkers, can realize a substantial profit. This surplus profit, which in case flows from a monopoly price, is transformed into rent and accrues in this form to the landowner by virtue of his title to the portion of the earth endowed with these special properties. Here, therefore, the monopoly price creates the rent. Conversely, the rent would create the monopoly price if corn were sold not only above its price of production, but also above its value, as a result of the barrier that landed property opposes to the rent-free investment of capital on uncultivated land. Now, the fact that it is only the title. A number of people have the property in the earth that enables them to appropriate a part of society's surplus labor as tribute, and in an ever-growing measure as production develops, is concealed by the circumstance that the capitalized rent, i.e. precisely this capitalized tribute, appears as the price of land which can be bought and sold just like any other item of trade. For the buyer, therefore, his claim to rent does not appear as something obtained for nothing without the labor risk or the entrepreneurial spirit of capital, but rather as the return for his equivalent. Rent seems to him, as we've already noted, simply as interest on the capital with which he has purchased the land, and with it the claim to rent. In exactly the same way, it appears to the fact that it is only the title a number of people have to property in the earth that enables them to appropriate a part of society's surplus labor. as tribute, and in an ever-growing measure, as production develops, is concealed by the circumstance that the capitalized rent, i.e. precisely this capitalized tribute, appears as the price of land, which can be bought and sold just like any other item of trade. For the buyer, therefore, his claim to rent does not appear as something obtained for nothing without the labor, risk, or the entrepreneurial spirit of capital, but rather as the return for his equivalent. Rent seems to him, as we've already noted, simply as interest on the capital with which he has purchased the land, and with it the claim to rent. Rent seems to him, as we've already noted, simply as interest on the capital with which he has purchased the land, and with it the claim to rent. In exactly the same way, it appears to the slave owner who has bought a black slave that his property in the slave is created not by the institution of slavery as such, but rather by the purchase and sale of this commodity. But the purchase does not produce the title. It simply transfers it. The title must be there before it can be bought, and neither one sale nor a series of sales, their constant repetition, can create this title. It was entirely created by the relations of production. Once these have reached the point where they have to be sloughed off, the material source, the economically and historically justified source of the title that arises from the process of the social production of life, ceases to exist, and with it, all transactions based on it. From the standpoint of a higher socioeconomic formation, the private property of particular individuals in the earth will appear just as absurd as the private property of one man in another man. Even an entire society, a nation, or all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not the owners of the earth. They're simply its occupiers, its beneficiaries, and they have to bequeath it in an improved state to the succeeding generations as boni patres familias, that is, good heads of the household. It has been seen, and here we disregard all fluctuations due to competition, all speculation in land, and even small-scale property where the earth forms the main instrument of the producers and must therefore be bought by whatever the price that, number one, Roman numeral 1, the price of land may rise without an increase in rent, namely merely through a fall in the rate of interest, which has the effect that land is sold at a higher price, and so capitalized rent, the price of land increases because of a growth in the interest on the capital incorporated into the land. Roman numeral 2, the price of land may rise because the rent increases. The rent may increase because the price of the product of the land rises. In which case, the rate of differential rent always rises, whether the rent on the worst cultivated land is high, low, or non-existent. By the rate of differential rent, we mean the ratio between the part of surplus value that is transformed into rent and the capital advanced to produce the agricultural product. This is different from the ratio between the surplus product and the total product. For the total product does not include the part of the constant capital advance which has not been consumed in the product but continues to exist alongside it, i.e. machinery. It is implied in this, however, that on those types of land that bear a differential rent, a growing portion of the product is transformed into excess surplus product. Now, we shall examine this point more closely in the section on differential rent. On the worst land, it is the rise in price of the product on the land that creates rent for the first time, and hence creates the price of land. But rent can also grow without any rise in the price of the agricultural product. This can remain constant or even decline. If it remains constant, this is only possible, leaving aside monopoly prices, for one of two reasons. Either, number one, because new lands of better quality are cultivated along with equally large capital investments on the older lands, which, however, are sufficient only to meet the increased demand so that the governing market price remains unchanged. In this case, the price of the older lands does not increase, but the price of the land newly taken up rises above that of the older land. Or, number two, because of the relative yield remaining the same and the market price to the amount of capital exploiting the land increases. Thus, even if the rent remains the same in proportion to the capital advance, it might double in amount, say, because the capital itself is double. Since there is no fall in the price, the second capital investment yields a surplus profit just as much as the first, which is similarly transformed into rent once the term of the tenancy expires. The amount of rent rises here because the amount of rent-producing capital rises. The contention that successive capital investments on the same stretch of land can produce a rent only insofar as their yield is uneven and therefore a differential rent arises amounts to saying that if two capitals of £1,000 each are invested on two equally productive fields, only one of them can yield rent, even when these two fields belong to the better class of land, which does yield a differential rent. The sum of rental income, the total ground rent of a country, therefore grows with the amount of capital invested, with the extension of cultivation. In short, without necessitating a rise in the price of the individual unit of land, or in the rate, or even the mass of rent. This can be combined with a fall in the rent on individual holdings. To deny this would be to maintain that capital investments made successively on two different pieces of land alongside one another in the same location would obey two different laws, although we can derive differential rent from an identical law in both cases, namely from differences in the productivity of capital investment, both on the same field and on different fields. Now, the only modification here, which is overlooked, is that when successive capital investments are applied to land in different locations, they come up against the barrier of landed property, which is not the case with successive capital investments on the same land. This is the reason for the check which these different forms of investment exert on each other. There's no difference in the capital involved here if the composition of capital remains the same. And similarly, the rate of surplus value, the rate of profit remains unaltered, so that with twice the capital, there is twice the amount of profit. The rate of rent also remains the same under these conditions. If a capital of £1,000 yields a rent of 2x and 2x, therefore 2,000 equals x, operator 1,000, right? But in relation to the area of land, which remains unchanged, since by our assumption double the amount of capital is at work on the same field, the result of the rise in the mass of rent is a rise in its rate as well. The same acre which brought in a rent of 50 now brings in a rent of 100, say. The total rate of rent has thus doubled. The proportion of one part of the surplus value, the money rent for money, is the independent expression of value to the land. As it stands, absurd and irrational, for it is incommensurable quantities that are measured against each other here. A particular use value, on the one hand, a piece of land of so and so many square feet, and exchange value, in particular surplus value, on the other. All this means in actual fact is that under given conditions, the ownership of these square feet of land enables the landowner to seize a certain amount of unpaid labor, which capital has realized by rooting in the soil like a pig in potatoes. Prima facie, however, the expression is as if one were to speak of the ratio of a 5-pound note to the diameter of the earth or some other heavenly body. But these irrational forms in which certain economic relationships appear and are grasped in practice are of no concern to the practical bearers of those relationships in their everyday dealings, since they are accustomed to operating within these forms. They do not think there is anything peculiar about them. A complete contradiction holds nothing at all mysterious for them. In forms of appearance that are estranged, that is, entfremdet from their interconnection and taken in isolation, are absurd. They feel as much at home as a fish in water. What Hegel says about certain mathematical formulae appears here too. What ordinary human understanding finds irrational is in fact rational, and what it finds rational is irrational. Since vulgar economics does nothing more than interpret, systematize, and turn into apologetics the notions of agents trapped within bourgeois relations of production, it should not surprise us that precisely in the estranged form of appearance of economic relations that involves these prima facie absurd and complete contradictions, and all science would be superfluous if the form of appearance of things directly coincided with their essence. Precisely here, vulgar economics feels completely at home. These relationships appearing all the more self-evident to it, the more their interconnections remain hidden, and the more they are comprehensible to the ordinary mind. Thus, it does not have the slightest suspicion that the trinity from which it proceeds, land rent, capital interest, labor wages, or price of labor, consists of a conflation of three things, that is, land rent, capital interest, labor wages, or price of labor, consists of a conflation of three things which is prima facie impossible to perform. First, we have the use value of the land, which has no value, and the exchange value, rent. Here, then, a social relation conceived as a thing is placed in a proportionate relationship with nature. What we have here is two incommensurable magnitudes. Then, capital interest. If capital is conceived as a certain sum of value with its independent expression in money, it is prima facie nonsense that a value should have more value than its worth. This form, capital interest, is precisely the form in which any mediation appears, and capital is reduced to its most general formula, but for this reason also it is a formula that is absurd and inexplicable. This is precisely the reason why the vulgar economist prefers the formula capital interest with its occult quality of a value that is unequal to itself to the formula capital profit, as here we already get somewhat closer to the actual capital relation. Then again, disturbed by the feeling that 4 is not 5, and hence 100 shillings cannot possibly be 110 shillings, he flees from capital as value to the material substance of capital, to its use value as one of labor's conditions of production, i.e. machinery, raw material, etc. It is then possible, instead of the incomprehensible first relationship in which 4 equals 5, to construct this time a completely incommensurable relationship between a use value, a thing, on the one side of the equation, and a specific social relation of production, surplus value, on the other. As in the case of landed property, as soon as this incommensurability is attained, everything becomes clear to the vulgar economist, and he feels no need for further reflection, for he has reached exactly what is quote-unquote rational to the bourgeois mind. Finally, labor wages, the price of labor, is an expression which, as we have shown earlier, footnote 50, absolutely contradicts the concept of value, and equally, therefore, that of price. This being in general only a specific expression of value, so that the price of labor is as irrational as a yellow logarithm. The vulgar economist, though, is exceedingly satisfied, since he's now reached the profound insight of the bourgeois that he pays money for labor, and the very contradiction between this formula and the concept of value relieves him from the obligation of understanding the latter. As far as the land area itself is concerned, a rise in the amount of rent is thus expressed in the same way as a rise in the rate of rent. Hence the embarrassment when the conditions that would explain the one case are absent in the other. The price of land can rise even if the price of its product declines. In this case, the differential rent, and therefore the price of land, may have increased by a further differentiation. Or, if this is not the case, increased productivity of labor may have led to a fall in the price of specific quantities of the product, such as, for example, a bushel, while at the same time the number of bushels has increased more than their price has fallen. Assume that 1 quarter, or 8 bushels, costs 60 shillings. If 16 bushels were produced instead of 8 on the same acreage with the same capital, the cost of a bushel was previously 7.5 shillings, and the bushel costs 5 shillings, then the quarter, that is 8 bushels, would cost 40 shillings, which is a considerable fall in price. 16 bushels would now cost 16 times 5 equals 80, so that the value of the product of the same capital on the same acreage would have risen by a third, that is 33 1/3%, although the price of a bushel has fallen from 7.5 to 5. The way in which this is possible, even though the product is not sold above its price of production or its value, will be examined when we consider differential rent. In actual fact, it's possible in only two ways. Either poor land is withdrawn from competition, but the price of the better land rises if the differential rent grows, so that the greater improvement has had an uneven effect on the different types of land, or the same price of production on the worse land and in the same value if absolute rent is paid is expressed in a larger amount of product owing to increased labor productivity. The product still represents the same value as before, but the price of its aliquot parts has fallen while their number has increased. If the same capital is applied, this is impossible, for in that case, the same value is always expressed in any portion of the product. It is possible, however, if an extra capital is invested for gypsum, guano, etc., the condition is that the price of the individual bushel, even though it does not fall in the same ratio as the number of bushels increases. Roman numeral 3. The various conditions for a rise in rent, hence either in the price of land in general or that of particular types of land, may in part compete with each other, in part exclude each other, and it can be that they only take effect in turns. But it follows from the above discussion that a rise in the price of land does not in itself mean a rise in rent, and that we cannot conclude that a rise in rent, which always brings with it a rise in the price of land, will always mean an increase in its products. Instead of returning to the actual natural causes for the exhaustion of land, which incidentally were unknown to any of the economists who wrote about differential rent, on account of the backward state of agricultural chemistry in their time, they resort to the superficial conception that there is a limit to the amount of capital that can be invested in a particular field for reasons of space. The Edinburgh Review, for example, counters Richard Jones by saying that the whole of England cannot be fed by cultivating Soho Square. Now, this is seen as a particular disadvantage of agriculture, but precisely the opposite is the case. Here, successive capital investments can be made to bear fruit just because the earth itself functions as an instrument of production, which is not the case with a factory, where it functions only as the foundation, the site, the spatial base of operations. Or at least this is the case only to a very limited extent. It's certainly possible to concentrate a great productive installation in a small space compared with fragmented handicraft production, and this is what modern industry does. But once the level of productivity is given, a certain space is always required, and building upwards is only possible to a certain degree without multiplying the costs involved. If this were not the case, why would the manufacturer be forced to extend his factory or to build a second building next to the first one? The fixed capital invested in machines, etc., is not improved by use. On the contrary, it depreciates. Here, too, particular improvements are possible as a result of new discoveries. Steam boilers can be improved, etc. But taking the development of productivity as given, machinery can only deteriorate. When productivity develops rapidly, the whole of the old machinery must be replaced by a more advantageous kind, and it is therefore lost. The advantage enjoyed by the earth is that successive capital investments on it are possible without the loss of the earlier ones, and this, at the same time, implies the possibility of a difference in yield between these successive capital investments. It is necessary to clarify the exact nature of the difficulty faced by modern economics as the theoretical expression of the capitalist mode of production in its treatment of ground rent. What this difficulty is, and has still not been understood even by a large number of contemporary writers, as is shown by each fresh attempt to give ground rent a new explanation. The novelty in this case almost always consists in a regression to standpoints long since superseded. The difficulty is not one of explaining the surplus value produced by agricultural capital and the surplus product that corresponds to it. This question is solved by an analysis of the surplus value produced by productive capital in general, wherever the sphere in which it has been productively invested. The difficulty consists rather in showing how, after the equalization of surplus value between the various capitals to give the average profit, whereby they receive a share in the total surplus value produced by the social capital in all spheres of production together that corresponds and is proportionate to their relative sizes, or to the aliquot part they form in the total social capital in showing how, after this equalization, after the distribution of all the surplus value that there is to distribute has apparently already taken place, there's still an excess part of this surplus value left over. A part which capital invested on the land pays to the landowner in the form of ground rent and where it comes from, quite apart from the practical motives which goaded the modern economists to investigate the question as spokesman for industrial capital against landed property, motives which we shall include in a more detail in the chapter on the history of ground rent, footnote 53. The question was of decisive interest for them as theorists to concede that the phenomenon of rent for capital invested in agriculture stemmed from a particular effect of the sphere of investment itself, from the earth's crust or certain properties pertaining to it, would be to renounce the very concept of value itself, i.e., to abandon any possibility of scientific knowledge in this area. Even the simple perception that rent is paid out of the price of the agricultural product, which is true even when it's paid in kind, if the farmer is to extract his price of production from it, showed the absurdity of explaining the excess of this price over and above the customary price of production, i.e., the relative dearness of agricultural products in terms of the actual extra natural productivity of agricultural industry over the productivity of other branches of industry, because, on the contrary, the more productive labor is, the cheaper each aliquot part of its product, since the greater the amount of use value in which the same quantum of labor, i.e., the same value, is represented. That's one hell of a sentence. The whole difficulty in analyzing rent thus consisted in explaining the excess of agricultural profit over average profit, not surplus value as such, but rather the extra surplus value specific to this sphere of production, not even the net product, but rather the excess of this net product over the net product of our branches of industry. The average profit itself is a product formed by a process of social life proceeding under quite particular historical relations of production, a product which, as we have seen, presupposes very far-reaching mediations. If we are to speak of an excess over the average profit, this average profit must first be established as a measure, and as is the case in the capitalist mode of production, as the overall regulator of production. Thus, in forms of society where it is not yet capital that performs this function of extracting all surplus value or surplus labor and appropriating it for itself, at least in the first instance, where capital has not yet subsumed society's labor or has done so only sporadically, there can be no question at all of rent in the modern sense, of rent as an excess over and above the average profit, i.e., over and above the proportionate share of each individual capital in the total surplus value that the total capital produces. It shows the naivete of Monsieur Passy, on which more below that he speaks of rent in the most primitive conditions speaks of rent in the most primitive conditions as already a surplus over and above profit, a historically determined social form of the surplus value, which, according to Monsieur Passy, can exist on a natural basis even without any society. For the early economists who were only just beginning to analyze the capitalist form of production, which was, moreover, in their time still undeveloped, the analysis of rent presented either no difficulty at all or else a difficulty of a quite different kind. Petit, Cantillon, and all those other writers who stand closer to the feudal period assume that ground rent is the normal form of surplus value, while profit for them is still lumped indiscriminately together with wages, or at most appears as a portion of this surplus value extorted from the landowner by the capitalist. They therefore base themselves on a state of affairs in which, firstly, the agricultural population is still the overwhelming majority of the nation, and secondly, the landowner still appears as the person who appropriates, in the first instance, the excess labor of the immediate producers by way of his monopoly of landed property. In addition to this, landed property still appears as the main condition of production. Nothing could be more alien to them than a way of posing the question, which proceeded from the standpoint of capitalist production and sought to investigate how landed property manages to extract again from capital a part of the surplus value that capital has produced, i.e., extorted from the immediate producers, and in the first instance, already appropriated. With the physiocrats, the difficulty is quite of another kind. As the first systematic interpreters of capital, they try to analyze the nature of surplus value in general. For them, this analysis coincides with the analysis of rent, the only form in which surplus value existed for them. Rent-bearing or agricultural capital, therefore, is for them the only capital that produces surplus value. And the agricultural labor that it sets in motion is the only labor giving rise to surplus value, quite correctly from the capitalist standpoint, the only truly productive labor. They quite rightly regard the production of surplus value as the determining element. Apart from other services, which we shall discuss later on, theirs is the great merit of returning from commercial capital, which operates only in the sphere of circulation, to productive capital, in contrast to the supporters of the mercantile system, which was, in its crude realism, the actual vulgar economics of the day, and which, with its practical interests, entirely swamped the beginnings of scientific analysis conducted by Petty and his successors. In relation to our critique of the mercantile system, it should be borne in mind that we're concerned only with its conceptions of capital and surplus value. We've already noted, footnote 57, that the monetary system correctly proclaims that production for the world market and the transformation of the product into a commodity, hence into money, is the precondition and requirement for capitalist production. In its continuation as the mercantile system, it's no longer the transformation of commodity value into money that is decisive, but instead the production of surplus value, albeit from the irrational standpoint of the circulation sphere, and at the same time in such a way that this surplus value is expressed in surplus money in a favorable balance of trade. But it is also the characteristic feature of the self-interested merchants and manufacturers of that time, and belongs to the period of capitalist development that they represent, that the transformation of feudal agricultural societies into industrial societies and the resulting industrial struggle of nations on the world market involves an accelerated development of capital, which cannot be obtained in the so-called natural way by only compulsory means. It makes an enormous difference whether the national capital is transformed into industrial capital gradually and slowly, or this transformation is accelerated over time by the taxes they impose through protective duties which rest, in fact, on the landlords, the yeomanry, and the artisans by the accelerated expropriation of independent direct producers, and by the forcibly accelerated accumulation and concentration of capital, in short, by the accelerated establishment of the conditions of capitalist production. It also makes an enormous difference in the capitalist and industrial exploitation of the nation's natural productive power. The national character of the mercantile system is therefore not just cant when its spokesmen refer to it. On the pretext of being concerned only with the wealth of the nation and sources of assistance for the state, they declare, in fact, that the interests of the capitalist class and of enrichment in general are the ultimate purpose of the state, and they proclaim their support for bourgeois society is against the old supernatural state. At the same time, however, they show their awareness that the development of the interests of capital and the capitalist class of capitalist production has become the basis of the nation's power and predominance in modern society. The physiocrats were also correct to say that, in fact, all production of surplus value, and thus also every development of capital, rested on the productivity of agricultural labor as its natural foundation. If men are not even capable of producing more means of subsistence in a working day, and thus, in the narrowest sense, more agricultural products than each worker needs for his own reproduction, if the daily expenditure of the worker's entire labor power is only sufficient to produce the means of subsistence indispensable for his individual needs, there can be no question of any surplus product or surplus value at all. A level of productivity of agricultural labor which goes beyond the individual needs of the worker is the basis for all society, and in particular the basis of the capitalist mode of production, which releases an ever-growing part of society from the direct production of the means of subsistence, transforming them, as Stewart says, into free hands, footnote 58, and making them available for exploitation in other spheres. But what should we say of contemporary economic writers such as Dare, Passy, etc., who, now that classical economics has run its course when it is actually on its deathbed, repeat the most primitive ideas about the natural conditions of surplus labor and hence surplus value in general, believing themselves to have said something new and striking about ground rent, long after this ground rent has been explained as a particular form and a specific portion of surplus value. It is precisely characteristic of vulgar economics that what in a now superseded stage of development was new, original, profound, and justified is repeated at a time when it is flat, incorrect, and stale. It thereby acknowledges that it does not even have an inkling of the problems with which classical economics was concerned. It confuses these with questions that are put forward only at a lower state of development of bourgeois society. It is just the same with its incessant and self-satisfied chewing over of physiocratic notions about free trade. These have long since lost any and every theoretical interest, even if they may be still of some practical interest to some state or other. In a genuine natural economy, where no part of the agricultural product, or only a very small part, enters into the circulation process, and this is itself only a relatively insignificant part of that product that represents the landowner's revenue, as for example, in many ancient Roman latifundia, as also in the manors of Charlemagne's time, and more or less throughout the Middle Ages, see Vichard. The whole of the product and surplus product of estates by no means consisted simply of the products of agricultural work. It equally included the products of industrial work. The existence of domestic handicrafts and manufacture as an ancillary pursuit to agriculture, which is the basic activity, is the condition for the mode of production on which this natural economy rests, both in European antiquity and medieval times, and still today in the village communities of India, where their traditional form of organization has not yet been destroyed. The capitalist mode of production completely abolishes this connection, a process which can be studied on a large scale, particularly during the last third of the 18th century in England. People who had grown up in more or less semi-feudal societies, such as Herrenschwan, for example, still considered this separation of agriculture and manufacture as a foolhardy social venture, as an incomprehensibly risky mode of existence at the end of the 18th century. And even in those agricultural economies of ancient times, which show the greatest similarities with the capitalist rural economy, namely Carthage and Rome, the appropriate analogy is with a plantation economy rather than with the form really corresponding to the capitalist mode of production, footnote 62. There is a formal analogy, although one which also appears to be completely deceptive in all essential points for someone who has understood the capitalist mode of production, unlike Herr Mommsen, who discovers the capitalist mode of production as soon as a monetary economy appears. Even such a formal analogy is to be found nowhere in mainland Italy in ancient times, but perhaps only in Sicily, since this served as an agricultural tributary for Rome, its agriculture being essentially designed for export. Here one can find farmers in the modern sense. An incorrect conception of the nature of rent has been handed down to modern times, a conception based on the fact that rent in kind still survives from the Middle Ages, in complete contradiction to the conditions of the capitalist mode of production, partly in the tithes paid to the church, and partly as a curiosity in old contracts. The impression is thus given that rent arises not from the price of the agricultural product, but from its quantity, not from social relations, but from the earth itself. We've already shown how, even though surplus value is expressed in a surplus product, it is not true, conversely, that any surplus product, in the sense of a mere increase in the quantity of the product itself, represents a surplus value. It can represent a deduction from value. Otherwise, the cotton industry would have had to show an enormous surplus value in 1866 compared with 1846, even though the price of yarn had fallen. Rent may grow enormously as a result of a series of bad harvests, since the price of corn rises, even though this surplus value is expressed in an amount of dearer wheat, which is growing smaller in absolute terms. Conversely, a series of good years may lead to a fall in rent because the price falls, even though the lower rent is expressed in a greater amount of cheaper wheat. The first thing to note about rent in kind, then, is that it is simply a tradition brought over from another mode of production. which survives as a ruin of its former existence, while its contradiction with the capitalist mode of production is shown by the way that it disappeared automatically from private contracts, and where legislation could intervene, as with the tithes, was forcibly abolished as an incongruity, footnote 64. Secondly, however, where it continued to exist on the basis of the capitalist mode of production, it was nothing more and could be nothing more than an expression of money rent in medieval guise. Say that a quarter of wheat stands at 40 shillings. Out of this 1/4, one part must replace the wages contained in it and be sold so as to advance these again. Another part must be sold in order to pay the rent due as taxes. Seed corn and a certain amount of manure are themselves involved in reproduction as commodities, wherever the capitalist mode of production and the division of social labor associated with it are developed. And so replacements for these must be bought. A further part of the quarter must be sold to supply money for this. Inasmuch as they do not actually have to be bought, do not really enter into the metamorphosis of commodities, but are taken from the product in kind to go once more as conditions of production into its reproduction, which happen not only in agriculture, but in many branches of production that produce constant capital, they are entered into the books in money of account and deducted as constituents of the cost price. The wear and tear of machinery and fixed capital in general must be replaced in money. Finally, there is the profit, which is reckoned on the sum of those expenses that are expressed in real money or in money of account. This profit is represented by a particular part of the gross product determined by its price. The part that then remains forms the rent, if the contractual product rent is greater than this residue as determined by the price. It does not form rent, but is a deduction from profit. Simply by virtue of this possibility, that is product rent, which does not follow the constant price of the commodity, and therefore it can therefore come to either more or less than the actual rent, and which can form a deduction not just from profit, but from the components required to replace the capital, is antiquated and ripe for removal. This product rent, in fact, insofar as it is rent not simply in name but in actual fact, is determined exclusively by the excess of the price of the product over its cost of production. It simply takes this variable magnitude as a constant one. But it is such a homely idea that the product first suffices in kind to feed the workers and then to leave the capitalist farmer more food than he needs, that the surplus over and above that forms the natural rent. It would be just the same with a calico producer who produces 200,000 ells of cloth. This is not only sufficient to clothe his workers and to more than clothe his wife and all his offspring and himself, it also leaves him calico to sell and finally to pay a hefty rent in kind. It is such a simple matter. We deduct the production cost of the 200,000 ells, and a surplus of calico must remain over as rent. But what an artificial and naive idea it is to deduct production costs of, say, 15,000 pounds from the 200,000 ells without knowing the sale price of calico. To deduct money from calico, an exchange value from a use value, and then to determine the surplus calico in terms of pounds sterling. It is worse than squaring the circle, which is at least based on the concept of limits, in which straight lines and curves merge together. But this is Monsieur Passy's recipe. We deduct money from calico before the calico is transformed into money, either in the mind or in actuality. The surplus is the rent, and however should be treated naturally. See, for example, Karl Arndt, and not with diabolical sophistries. It is foolishness such as this, the deduction of the production costs, the production price from so and so many bushels of wheat, the subtraction of a sum of money from a cubic measure, which is the logical conclusion of this whole natural development of rent. If we consider ground rent in its simplest form, labor rent, where the direct producer devotes 1/4 of the week with tools that belong to him either legally or in practice, the plow, the draft animals, etc., to land that is in practice his own, and works the other days of the week for the landlord on his estate gratuitously, the situation here is still completely clear. Rent and surplus value are identical. Rent and not profit is the form in which the unpaid surplus labor is expressed. compare what was said about this form in Book 1 of Capital, Chapter 2. The extent to which the worker, a self-sustaining serf, can obtain a surplus over his indispensable means of subsistence, hence a surplus over what we in the capitalist mode of production would call the minimum amount of wages, depends, assuming all other circumstances remain the same, on the extent, the length of his statute labor. This surplus over and above the necessary means of subsistence, which is the germ of profit in the capitalist mode of production, is thus entirely determined by the level of ground rent, which here not only is, but appears as unpaid surplus labor, labor for the proprietor of the conditions of production, which here coincide with the land itself, or inasmuch as they are distinct from it, count merely as an accessory to it. That the serf's product must be sufficient in this case to replace his conditions of labor as well as his subsistence is a situation that remains the same in all modes of production, since it is not a result of this specific form, but rather a natural condition for all continuing and reproductive labor in general, of any continuing production that is always at the same time reproduction, also reproduction of its own conditions of operation. It is clear, too, that in all forms where the actual worker himself remains the possessor of the means of production and the conditions of labor needed for the production of his own means of subsistence, the property relationship must appear at the same time as a direct relationship of domination and servitude, and the direct producer, therefore, as an unfree person whose unfreedom may, however, undergo a progressive attenuation from serfdom with statute labor down to a mere tribute obligation. The direct producer, in this case, is, on our assumption, in possession of his own means of production, the objective conditions of labor needed for the realization of his labor and the production of his means of subsistence. He pursues his agriculture independently as well as the rural domestic industry associated with it. I'm going to stop right here because I've already gone over time. And but needless to say, discussion as in Asia. Well, let me finish this last. This independence is not abolished when in India, as for example, the self-sustaining peasants form among themselves a more or less natural community of producers, since what is at issue here is independence vis-a-vis the nominal landlord. Under these conditions, the surplus labor for the nominal landowner can only be extorted from them by extra economic compulsion, whatever form this might assume. This differs from the slave or plantation economy in that the slave works with conditions of production that do not belong to him and does not work independently. Relations of personal dependence are therefore necessary. In other words, personal unfreedom in whatever degree, and being chained to the land as his accessory, bondage in the true sense. If there are no private landowners, but it is the state, as in Asia, which confronts them directly as simultaneously landowner and sovereign, rent and tax coincide, or rather there does not exist any tax distinct from this form of ground rent. Under these conditions, the relationship of dependence does not need to possess any harsher form, either politically or economically, than that which is common to all subjection to the state. Here, the state is the supreme landlord. Sovereignty here is landed property concentrated at the national level. But for this very reason, there is no private landed property, although there is both private and communal possession, a usufruct of the land. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. We're reading chapter 6 of the Fowkes Moseley edition of the economic manuscripts of 1864 to 65. Thank you for your attention.